Hello, I have recently decided to go into the Into Thin Air literary canon. This book has been on my radar for years. It's not necessarily something I typically read, more like literary fiction or whatever. I'm not outdoorsy. The extent of my outdoor experience is that I'm dating an Eagle Scout, and I was given a push to actually read this upon hearing about it more recently, and then also hearing that this is not the only book written about this disaster. There's so many books about it, and they don't always agree. I've decided to read as many of them as I can stand. I'm locked in, which is unfortunate because I didn't particularly care for Into Thin Air. Essentially, John Krakauer was on a commercial guided expedition where the other clients paid to be there. He was there kind of as an influencer before there were influencers. Then there was a bad storm on the day that they and a few other teams were ascending to the summit of Everest, and a lot of people died. Well, he'll argue later that it was a safer season than average, and when you take in the entire history of Everest in a pretty sloppily used statistic. But 8 people died as a consequence of that storm, and 4 of them were on the expedition he was on. As I said, I did not particularly enjoy this book. I have a tendency to be a hater, but I went into it with the purest of intentions, and in some preliminary research, I saw that this book is mainly controversial in its portrayal of a few people who I will get to later, but the general consensus is that of the Everest books, this one is known to have some of the better writing because Krakauer was a working journalist and still is. The writing I was expecting to be nice, and also a lot of the advanced praise in the beginning of the book says that, oh, this is like nonfiction that'll read like fiction. It's so exciting, so thrilling. This feels like a fiction book, which I think nonfiction it can stand on its own. It doesn't need to read like fiction to be entertaining, but it does kind of. I opened it up and it felt like a fantasy book. There's a map, and then this is like all character names of people on the mountain. So one of the things about the writing I didn't care for was almost an abuse of dramatic irony. It felt like the whole lead up before he actually documents most of the tragic events is that it's like, Robert Hall, my expedition leader, the best who's ever done it, the best guy there was, kept being concerned that something bad was going to happen up there to one of the other teams, and that he was going to need to impact his own summit attempt and his clients to help them. Little did he know that it would actually be his team mostly in peril, and that his own life would be lost. I can understand the function that has in telling the story, but it was like every single chapter, and these chapters are short, would end on something being like, Robert Hall said, I sure hope nothing bad happens up there, and also I cannot wait to get back to my pregnant wife. And it was just a bit much. Krakauer loses that sense of obviousness when describing some other aspects of the expedition. It's kind of a point of contention that maybe his own presence there as a journalist who was explicitly going to write about this even prior to the disaster could have impacted some of the decisions and actions taken by the guides and climbers, because no one wanted to like do something silly and have that publicized. Backtracking a little bit, John Krakauer was there on an assignment for Outside Art magazine that he proposed. He was like, hey magazine, if you get one of the good guides to take me up to the mountain, I'll write a story about it for you. You will need to finance it, and it's a lot of money because logistically it's expensive. Like getting oxygen, it's a long time. Employing guides and Sherpas, well, they pay Sherpas in dust. Also, there's drama with Everest borders Nepal and China, and each side like is charging more for their permits, so the other side will charge more for their permits, and they're trying to like limit the amount of climbers for safety reasons, but then they can go on the other side, and then it's like, oh well, we don't want to lose out our funds, so it's kind of competition there for money. And so it's expensive to climb Everest for many reasons, and he could not bankroll it himself, and he was like, it was a boyhood dream though. So he gets the magazine to do it, and they were between two expeditions, and Rob Hall essentially gave them the lowest price, but both of the expeditions were willing to take Krakauer on for less, like even at a loss, to get the publicity of having their guides be written about in the article, and also running ads in the magazine to appeal to the audience of wealthy outdoorsy people who would then subsequently maybe pay to go on their expeditions. So you did not want to come across as a bad expedition in Krakauer's coverage. A bad expedition for some clients is just not getting to the top. They're like, I don't care if it's unsafe. Like, who are you to tell me I can't go to the top? And because yeah, it's a lot of money, it's a lot of time. The whole reason they're there is because they want to summit Everest. So Krakauer being there to publicize guides and these services and everything, everyone wanted to make it to the top more so than normal, because this would be an extra bad year to not make it because it would be publicized. The only place in the actual text of the book that this is brought up is from an extended block quote from another client on the team, Beck Weathers, from an interview with ABC News in an unaired segment. So can't find it anywhere else. Say what I will about some of the stuff in this book. Krakauer does have access to more information to pull from than most people, at least. So there's a lot of information sources that might not be accessible to some of the other writers I'll be reading from. Essentially, Beck Weathers in this interview was like, yes, a journalist there was impactful to decision making, and I think it definitely, I can't see how it wouldn't have impacted Rob Hall's decision making. And that's the only mention of it in the book. Afterward, or an author's note, there's like 10 different things, but one of the things, he's defending himself against another book, and he says, they say I didn't get into that enough. There was a lengthy quote on one page about that. And it's like, I wish we would have gotten more into other things regarding the expedition instead of dramatic irony of everyone who's dying being like, I'm writing my loved ones, I can't wait to get back to them, yay. And then it's like, little did they know this would be the last correspondence he would have. Some more personal gripes with the writing is coming from my perspective of reading this as a young person who was born after the events of this book, after it was published. And in 2024, he would quote things that people posted on the internet, and there was one team that had a corporate sponsor of Apple Computer. That was just kind of silly to me because it sounds like archaic. You know, it was the 90s, which is also, I'm not going to be like getting into some other things in the book that I've taken issue with that I think would just be chalked up to the time difference. And it's not necessarily to do with the content of the book per se, because I don't want this to be too long, and I don't want to talk about every weird little thing he wrote, but there's stuff in there that I'm just going to chalk up to it being somewhat dated. One criticism of the writing I have is it kind of read Wattpad-esque. Apparently in high altitudes, it is very difficult to consume food. You don't feel hungry, but you're also super dehydrated. Bodies are different up there, and it is wild. But there'd be times when he would be talking about, oh yeah, I forced down a handful of M&Ms. They tumbled outside my tent, so weak, but ready. Quote here, which Rob had told us to leave at 5:45 sharp, which allowed barely enough time to dress, force down a candy bar and some tea, strap on my crampons. I was half expecting him to like put his hair in a messy bun and step out the tent, and then Rob Hall's there and it's like, I've sold you to One Direction. It just felt goofy, and it just kind of took me out of everything a bit, and I did go into this with higher expectations of the writing, and it just wasn't delivering. There's also some stuff in the actual text of the book that sort of referred to Krakauer's lack of command of language. One of them is like they're at like a makeshift funeral session on the mountain for those who lost, and he's like, I stammered out some remembrances, and it's like, that is completely understandable and valid, like to not be well spoken at a funeral. One part that really made me question his writing and ability to speak, talk, use language, something I'm not the best at, as you can see. I'm flapping a little. He's talking about some of the earliest dinners as the expedition team, and that like a lot of the doctor clients apparently were commanding the conversation, and Beck Weathers in particular started talking about politics and being like, oh, liberals these days, and they want welfare, and you know, and then John's like, I very reasonably brought up that I think the minimum wage should be increased. And then he's like, and then I got yelled at and I was just fumbling a vowel. I lacked the wherewithal to rebuke him. And then he's like, I was so mad, I was seething. And it's like, you can't even hold a debate about like economic policies, like minimum wage. Like, this was early in the expedition. It's not like they're all like dead or tired. Well, not dead, but anyway. And it's like, he's a professional journalist. And also, I didn't find the text very successful. So I was just left confused on his writing abilities and also his physical abilities. For this story, he was actually approached like the year before or so by Outside magazine, I keep wanting to say Outdoors, to go to base camp and write a story there of everyone coming through base camp, which is still pretty high up, I learned. I was like, what? It's called base camp, but it is actually pretty high altitude. He was considering doing that, but he was like, I can't go out there to base camp without the opportunity to climb higher. And mind you, he'd never been higher than base camp in his life. His best mountaineering years were behind him. He's kind of simmered down a bit on climbing, but even in his peak, he was doing more so challenging in other ways than just mere altitude. So he hadn't been up high that altitude. He tells the magazine, I won't do that story. However, if you pay for me to go on an expedition, I'll go and I'll write that story, only from a very reputable guide, of course. Fair enough, whatever. And the magazine does it, and he's like, okay, cool, I'm going to do it. But then he's like, I'm out of like my best climbing shape, my best years are behind me. He says that he wants 12 months to prepare to get into Everest shape. And it is never mentioned what he does in that year to prepare, which is something that I was curious about, and I would have liked to see more descriptions of. And he even says at another point in the book that in the lead up to going to Everest, if people would be like, wow, John, are you ready to go? Or like if his wife was like it's gonna be dangerous, like are you going up there, he would deflect and be like, oh well, I'm being there mainly as a journalist, I probably won't go much higher than base camp, I'm just there to write the story, they want to send me, so I'm going. He pushed for this story to happen. Then he was also kind of lying to, well, not, that's a strong word, but trying to insinuate that he, at least how it's portrayed here, that he was not intending on climbing to the top, even though he was like, yeah, I wanted to go to the top, I'll go to the top as far up as my incapable body will let me. His wife, she's dropping him off at the airport, and she's like, it's clear you're going to want to climb up there, and I just want you to know that this will not just be impacting you if you die, like it'll impact me for the rest of my life. And he says, I'm not going to die, don't be melodramatic. He also disparages some of the other more commercial guided climbers historically, who the idea of the commercial guiding is that you're essentially paying skilled people to carry you to the top, so you could say you summited, but really you couldn't do it alone, which most people can't. I would say you still need groups, Sherpas, guides, well, maybe not the guides, but, or the, yeah, anyway. And he talks about the first summit of A more amateur climber was this guy named Dick Bass in 1985, who was heavily guided, he says, by David Bredshears, who's in the book later, but he's like, yeah, now Everest is kind of overtaken by people who might not have the skills but do have the means. Fair enough, but it seems like Krakauer leaves himself out of this critique. I don't think he was ever going to have earned a place on an Everest expedition based on skill alone, and he doesn't even have the funds alone, which it's an obscene amount of money. Even to my 2024 post-inflation brain, it's a lot. It was like 70,000, and this was like in the 90s. He seems very quick to criticize others for things that he himself could also be criticized for. Occasionally he'll show some cracks of self-awareness, but mainly he likes to throw stones. Like one of the guides on his expedition, Andy Harris, Krakauer writes that Andy and I were very similar in terms of physical ability and technical expertise, which I don't believe, or it wasn't necessarily well established. It's interesting he's saying this. It's specifically in a section about Andy Harris, which is one of the people in which Krakauer's coverage of has been controversial, and not in a slanderous sense like with the others, but in that Krakauer kind of almost brushes upon claiming some culpability for Harris's death. In this section where he's saying that they had the same amount of physical ability and technical expertise, it was one of the last times, or the last time he saw Harris, and that he was clearly not acting right. He's like, in hindsight, he definitely had some sort of altitude sickness, something going on, delusion. He was like, I should have noticed, I should have done something. He blames it strictly on the fact that Harris was a guide and Krakauer a client, that he didn't even think to like look out for his well-being. And he's like, I cannot see how it would have been possible if we were on any other climb as equals. I would have overlooked this. But I don't know if they would have been on any climbs as equals. At least it's not super well demonstrated, if so. And it just seems like everyone was kind of getting a little wacky up there mentally. I mean, I'm not like blaming him, unlike himself. Krakauer has a tendency to overestimate his abilities in this book. Krakauer published his article for Outside Magazine 2 months before he finished the draft to this book. And the article was like 4 months after Everest, so this book was finished 6 months. More on that later. In the article, he very controversially claims to have seen Harris, talk to him, seen him reach the safety of some tents or the area, but then since when he wasn't seen again, posits that he must have been loopy and walked straight off the mountain. Evidence and other accounts since have kind of shown that that's not the case. Probably he interviews some other climber that he's like, Martin Adams, who was distrustful of reporters and so refused my interview request until after this article had went to print. And then in this conversation, it kind of becomes apparent, at least to John Krakauer, who must explain it, this aha moment to Martin Adams, that, oh, you were actually the guy I saw who I thought was Andy Harris, who I knew more closely, and you more distantly, but I could have sworn that was Harris I talked to. Krakauer's account was what like tied him to that area of the mountain that night, but now it's not, so it seems like he was elsewhere further up. But Krakauer's been telling anyone and everyone that, oh, I saw Harris, and oh, this is what happened. I'm a journalist. Yes, it's unfortunate. Everything that happened is unfortunate, but it almost reads as if like he is not making this claim, but you can almost feel it present, that it's like if Martin Adams had agreed to an interview sooner, I wouldn't have printed that in outside article. And so it was out of my hands. This is not a mistake that I could make. And then he kind of also victimizes himself. Like, how could I have made such an egregious mistake? Was I really so debilitated that I stared into the face of a near stranger and thought it was Harris? When he's questioning everyone else's accounts for authenticity because of the altitude. Also, he has his own instances of altitude delusion. When he was descending the mountain from the summit, he was like, I was seeing myself from the outside and I was wearing a green cardigan and wingtips. And he was not wearing those things. And so it just feels strange that he took so much stock in his own account of this one instance when, like, altitude can just explain a lot of inconsistencies across everything. He doesn't necessarily give this grace to believe everyone else when he was so certain he had to be right. And then when it was proven he wasn't, he was like, how could I have been so wrong? Like everyone else. What is known about Andy Harris, it seems like the most likely outcome is that at some point on the mountain during his descent, when he was already in somewhat of a debilitated state, he turned around to go back up to the mountain to assist Robert Hall and Doug Hansen. I think they all have H last names, who were also on the team higher up on the mountain who needed more oxygen. Krakauer paints this as like a big sweeping act of heroism that would cost him his life. And yes, that's very selfless, and to try and do that. I'll get more into this a little bit later, but it seems like Krakauer values ideas of heroism, and if you're in a debilitated state, going out and trying to do something, even if you will end up getting harmed gravely yourself, over something more pragmatic and trying to like make sure you're in a good state to help others first. And it is like, yes, that's brave of him, but then it's also like he left behind so many people too, and it is just very sad. Other figure that Krakauer kind of controversially covers is Sandy Hill Pittman, another client guest of a different commercial expedition, but similar one Krakauer himself was almost on. And they seem peers in certain senses, where that like she's also there almost as a journalist, but she's also extremely wealthy, so I think she probably at least paid for some of the trip expenses herself because she could, you know, means of wealth and class. Krakauer kind of mainly evokes her as almost a way to insulate himself from criticism. And he's like, oh yeah, if it was bad journalists were there, like Sandy, that could have like influenced people to push themselves harder and make bad calls. I can't believe Sandy Hill would do this. Like her being a celebrity. And it feels bitter and hateful and snide. There, in one of the afterward author notes, he talks about one of the other climbers criticizing his coverage of her, and he's like, I welcome all criticisms of my journalism, especially when it's done in a respectful way, and especially when it's just out of loyalty of a good friend, insinuating that the only reason anyone could take issue with his portrayal of her is due to being friends with her. He calls her like Jane Austen's Emma for being like rich and oblivious. It wasn't great, but I was prepared for worse, more blatant misogyny. So I'm kind of like, okay, a win's a win. The biggest figure that Krakauer clashes with in this book, or the portrayal of, I should say, is that of Anatoly Bukrev. Also, sorry if I'm butchering any of the names. He was a guide from kind of the opposing commercial guide that season who was ascending on the same day. So Krakauer was with Robert Hall's adventure consultants. Anatoly, Sandy were with Scott Fisher's Mountain Madness. Krakauer in this book kind of slanders Anatoly a little bit. Again, I was expecting it to be far worse. Preliminary research was making me like really scared that it's going to be harsher. But it's still pretty bad. He kind of insinuates that Anatoly's not a good guide, or made some bad decisions, which, I mean, not using bottled oxygen while climbing is kind of a choice, but whatever. I wasn't there. I wasn't born. I've never climbed a mountain. I've never used bottled oxygen. I think it mainly comes down to a difference in culture and then also views around climbing mountains. Krakauer is kind of trying to slander Bukarev for not being as attentive to the clients and doing everything for them and helping them out too much and being like there. But there's a quote from Bukarev saying, "If client cannot climb Everest without big help from guide, this client should not be on Everest. Otherwise, there can be big problems up high." And he was correct. Oh, in the postscript, which is different from the author's note, which is different from the afterword, Krakauer returning to defend himself against the climb, which was Anatoly's book, which is next on my reading list. And no, I haven't read it yet. I'm not going to weigh in. But there is a footnote in this postscript from one of Anatoly's friends, Simone Morrow. And this footnote kind of goes hard. Morrow, it says like he disagrees with how Anatoly was portrayed in Into Thin Air and said, "You didn't understand who Anatoly really was," Morrow explained. "You were American, he was Russian. You were new to 8,000 meter peaks. He was the best of all time at these altitudes. Nobody else had climbed 21 times to a summit over 8,000 meters. You are a normal alpinist. He was a fantastic athlete and survival's animal. You are economically sure. He knew hunger. In my opinion, you are like a man who, after reading a book about medicine, pretends to teach one of the world's most famous and capable surgeons how to be a doctor. When judging the decisions made by Anatoly in 1996, you must remember this. No clients on his team died." And like, obviously this is coming from like his best friend, but he has points. The major points is that none of the clients on Anatoly's team died, which part of that can all be chalked up to just luck. Like, it was bad luck that that storm hit then. But Anatoly did also run a solo rescue mission, essentially solo. He had like other people who alerted him. At Krakauer, I'm sure this lends to some of his bitterness, but he saved Sandy Hill and Charlotte Fox, another member of that team, who were. So it gets a little dicey. Descending got caught in the storm very bad. Everyone was very weak. It was not looking great. Low visibility, no one could remember where the tents were. If you were moving, if you're going further away. A biggish group of climbers descending together, kind of also a mix between the two expeditions, but mainly Mountain Madness. So some of the more capable ones went back to camp once they like saw the lights and they could like figure it out. And it was about 350 yards away. And so they get to camp and they're like, someone needs to go back and like drag as many of them back as possible. So Anatoly is the most capable one, and he does just that. On Krakauer, while Anatoly was running that rescue mission, was in like the same camp areas, but he was dead tired from his descent on oxygen. It was bad. But he's like, "Alas, I was never alerted of the rescue attempts, so I never would know if I was going to be able to help." But then someone else from his team who was like trying to rouse people to go with the rescue mission said, it was so obvious to me that you were down for the count. If you could have gotten up and out there, you would have immediately needed rescuing yourself. You were in no position to save anyone else. You could not do it then. And he's like, "But I was never roused, so who knows? Subtext, maybe I could have done what Anatoly did. Who knows?" And it's just a sort of smugness. And then he'll also describe things later. He'll be like, "If only I knew, I could have gone those mere 350 yards outside of camp and maybe saved someone else." It just feels like a way to almost undercut Anatoly's rescue and sort of at least from what I've read, unearned bravado. Like, oh, I could have been the hero. I should have been the hero. Which, back to Mauro, Anatoly's best friend's footnote quote about how Krakauer and Bukrev didn't really see eye to eye in certain respects. Almost seems like there's an element of cultural difference where, to use vague, loosely defined terms like West versus East, with the more Western ethos being, oh, I'm gonna be a hero. It's the honorable and heroic thing to abandon my expedition to save others who came unprepared or who have landed in hot water, but even because of the way Everest has become more commercial, arrived unprepared. Anatoly thinks the better approach to safety is to hopefully have everyone there be capable of handling themselves too, and so then to reduce, like, more harm reduction. Don't get into a situation that's like a pressure cooker, and create high risk situations, which will still happen, but it seems like more so courting danger by bringing people who are not very experienced climbers. But Krakauer seems to think it's more heroic if someone's ready to die than preserving their own life, which I think is more of a preservation of life than making ill-equipped rescue attempts, where if you can't handle it yourself in your current state, which of course the altitude has to play with everyone's judgment, feels messy, and that Krakauer would have found it more palatable if Anatoly had been with his clients and tried to die with them instead of being rested in a camp. And back to Mauro's quote, none of the clients on Anatoly's team died. Kind of back to cultural difference too, albeit they seem pretty ill-equipped, but he seemed to be dunking heavily on the Taiwanese expedition for certain like behaviors that he found like amoral or heartless, and then he didn't get too into it, anything that happened on the other side of the mountain, not the Nepali side, the Chinese side, where apparently this was also not very well reported, and I don't know if these corrections were made into this text, but it's not the most important part of this book. This is not where his experience and research super laid. There was a group of Japanese climbers who passed some climbers from the Indo-Tibetan border police expedition who also died in the storm, where they were like still struggling, and he kind of paints it as the Japanese expedition climbing the next day when they could have been alive did not offer any aid, did not offer help. Apparently, to real accounts, that kind of, it's more nuanced than that. It's varied. That might not be fully accurate. It seemed like most of the disaster came from just refusal to give up and wanting to keep summiting, even when the weather wasn't good, or not knowing when the weather was going to turn, but even continuing in spite of that. I don't want to speculate on like any specific person or persons at fault, because A, I don't really know, and B, like, again, no one was trying to hurt anyone except maybe the leader of the South African expedition who kept threatening to kill people. Like, I know he was speaking more on his own experience and what he was dealing with, but I need to read more about the South African expedition, because at least how it was presented here, that seems like the real drama. Grifting, fraud, unhingement. I digress. The final point I am going to bring up is that I take issue with some of Krakauer's journalistic practices here, either consciously or subconsciously. Like, this book reads like a defense of guided commercial expeditions and how he had a right to be there and he was supposed to be there. And it's sad for everyone else, but he could cut it, and he was there with the commercial expedition, so clearly it must be good. Right? Sort of like justifying most people's presence there. There's a practice of leaving a bunch of trash and garbage and used up oxygen tubes up in Everest and kind of harming the environment, it not being good. It's like, guided commercial expeditions get a bad rap for leaving trash behind, but now there's been some cleanup efforts, including those done by the leaders of the expeditions that are mainly focused in here. Hall and Fisher, particularly Fisher, seem to get rid of a bunch of used oxygen canisters. Krakauer kind of paints it as, oh, he was doing this for PR, for publicity. He thought it would be good publicity. It still kind of feels like, oh, the guided expeditions are so great for the mountain. They're cleaning up the trash that they left behind in years past. A very narrow view, and he seems to very clearly ignore things that don't agree with his point and his vantage and what he wants to convey. It's like, oh wow, the oil company made an oil spill, but they gave some of the ducks that were covered in oil bubble baths. But it's like, how did they get covered in oil? How did those canisters all get up there? Again, I'm not a climber. I don't understand the appeal of wanting to risk your life like that. He kind of says in the beginning, those who don't get it, don't get it. Those who do, do. And I respect that. I do understand that. But he seemed to be really ride or die, like defending the existence of these tours. Also, as I mentioned a little earlier, he got back from Everest. He needed to take some time. This was in the foreword, I believe, or the introduction. Yeah, the introduction. But needed to take some time to get the outside article in order. He said that the magazine was very nice. They let him push back some deadlines because he was dealing with a lot. Eventually, he got the article out, and it got some backlash for certain portrayals, mainly with his speculations about Andy Harris that turned out to be false. While it's not certain what happened to him, it seems certain that it was not what he posited in that article. He also says he got some timing errors wrong, and he's like, okay, I fixed it, and I've expanded upon it, and here you go. And I think it was just not a good idea to write this in 2 months after that article was published. The introduction is dated November 96, and it said that the article was in the September issue. So it feels like he did not give this adequate time to breathe. Yes, I guess something could be said about it still being raw and recent, but he could have like written down this manuscript and like kept it in a shoebox for a year or two, because then in one of the many afterward epilogues, something like, everyone else seems to move on, but not me. People seem to be unaffected by what happened or be getting on with their lives, but not me. I'm still haunted. No one else is experiencing survivor's guilt but me. He does kind of brush upon some of like the other people having stuff. He's like, one of the wives of the victims, she's been hospitalized for depression. I'm like, I wonder why. But it's been 6 months, and he's kind of talking about like the lasting impacts in that section, and I don't think 6 months was an adequate time span to look at, especially when it seems like the only content he added was the postscript basically going after the climb and not giving more time to, hey, maybe it's more than 6 months after a pretty horrific experience, you could maybe get to a place where you feel like you could get on better. And it seems like sort of hateful of others, or, oh, they seem to be getting on better than me. I guess they're just less affected. A less generous view, which I don't have, of why this book was published and written so quickly, that I've heard from others when I was like, and he wrote it in 2 months after that article, is that maybe he wanted to get that book deal when there was still public interest, which I don't agree with. I think in the foreword he was kind of like using it instead of therapy, or in addition to, I don't know if he was in therapy. He said it was like therapeutic, and yeah, I don't think he was in a rush to publish this for like clout or money, especially because this book has really stood the test of time. I checked this out before, but then I was like too busy to read it, and I had to return it because there was a hold list. I had to wait for it on the hold list first to get it, and then I had to get back on the hold list and get this again, and now I can't renew it again. I'm on a deadline. This is due in like a day or two, because people still want to read this book like how many years after. I don't think him trying to capitalize on public interest is a reason for writing it so quickly, because it is kind of an enduringly interesting story. Yeah, I'm losing daylight. I think this is almost it. One of the things that I took the most issue with, in the sense of him seeming to be defending what happened, defending the decisions made, like, unless maybe if you're Anatoly or Sandy, just for having the audacity to be there, doing essentially the same thing as him, but more flashily and femininely, is that he says, well, statistically, this season was safer than other seasons on Everest. I think when I looked it up, this was like the most fatal season in Everest history at that point. I think it's been surpassed in the 20-teens a couple times. At the time, it was like the deadliest. He said, well, historically, if you count the first attempts at climbing Everest that are recorded from like 1921 to 1996, 144 people died, and the peak was climbed some 630 times, a ratio of 1 in 4. Last spring, 12 climbers died and 8 reached the summit, a ratio of 1 in 7. That fails to account that for the first 30 years, at least, of Everest being attempted to climb in recorded history, it was not summited. So that lengthy span of time could only contribute to the death count. Then also it gets easier to climb over time once that territory becomes charted and not uncharted, and there's some infrastructure left behind. Of course, not all infrastructure, but there's more knowledge gained on how to climb. I'm sure the technology is advanced. It became more possible to summit Everest. It's like, yeah, even schlubs like Dick Bass could summit, even schlubs like John Krakauer. And then the fact that there's literally guided commercial trips that you could pay to be on without necessarily a bunch of qualifications. There was not a lot of talk into if there were qualifications, or if so, what they were. It feels lazy, his use of numbers here. He also said that only 3% of the 398 climbers who ascended higher than base camp in 96 died, which is slightly below the historical fatality rate of 3.3%. That's unclear if that's of anyone who's gone higher than base camp or in general, but again, it's not the same. It's a horrible oversight. It feels intentional to try and be like, well, it was actually safe. It actually wasn't that bad. It was fine for us to be there and do that. Like, better statistics would have been, at least the furthest back you could go would be from the first recorded summit in the 50s. I guess better would have been in like the past decade, or at least since it became more achievable for non-professional climbers since Dick Bass's ascent in 85. It's one of those things where you say something and it seems like trying to be shocking or twist your expectations and be like, well, if you look at the numbers, what you feel is not correct. Feel productive. It's like, I was astounded when I read that unchallenged, and he was like, this book has been challenged a lot and I fixed all the complaints people had, and he's like, no one's questioned the factualness, authenticity of like the facts in this book. It's like, people just take issue with how I said that they were, but it's not the facts that people are mad at, but I'm mad at these facts here and numbers. I was so mad. I was like, this is not a good comparison. I was losing my mind. Anyway, yes, it got very heated about those statistics, but I will say, for as much as I did kind of critique this book, I know so much more about climbing and Everest than I did before. I feel like I had to leave out a lot. It covered a lot. I know a lot more. Now, I do kind of maybe question the authenticity of some of that information. Good introduction, I think. I'm excited to read more. Yeah, the climb is next, but I have like at least like 7 or 8 books I want to read, at least. And then I also want to go into the Into Thin Air cinematic universe and watch the movies and the documentaries. This is ambitious, especially because I didn't even like it and I have no interest in mountaineering, but I am committed and I am going to do as much as I can bring myself to do.